Hello everybody and welcome back to another video for y'all today. For today's video, we're talking about a game whose soundtrack does not believe in volume control, emotional restraint, or letting you calm down for even 5 seconds. Because before you learn the controls, before you understand blade mode, and before you fully process why a cyborg ninja is sprinting up the side of a collapsing building, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance tells you exactly what kind of experience you signed up for through its music. This is not background noise, this is not put it on low while I focus. This is a soundtrack that kicks down the door, cranks the speakers to a level that worries your neighbors, and then asks if you're emotionally prepared for what's about to happen. Spoiler, you're not. Nobody is. And today, we're breaking down why the music of Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance works so incredibly well. How it turns combat into storytelling, and why over a decade later, it still goes harder than it has any right to. Seriously, this soundtrack is doing Olympic level lifting for a game where you suplex robots and argue philosophies mid-fight. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is a 2013 action game developed by Platinum Games and published by Konami. Unlike the stealth-focused entries that defined much of the Metal Gear series, Rising takes a sharp turn into a fast-paced, high-intensity hack-and-slash combat. Because at some point, someone looked at Metal Gear and said, what if we removed stealthiness entirely? You play as Raiden, now a fully cybernetic soldier in a world shaped by privatized warfare, political manipulation, and enough ideological arguments to fill a philosophy textbook. This is the future where conflicts aren't just fought with weapons but with beliefs, and sometimes those beliefs are screamed at you mid-boss fight. At a surface level, Rising can look like pure chaos. You're slicing enemies into dozens of pieces, suplexing massive machines, and occasionally fighting characters who seem like they've wandered in from a completely different genre. Underneath all of that is a surprisingly focused narrative about violence, justification, and the systems that encourage people to believe they're always in the right. The game constantly asks whether power makes actions justified, whether ideals excuse brutality, and whether fighting for the right reasons actually matter when the end result looks the same way every time. It just happens to ask those questions while blasting industrial metal and letting you throw cyborgs into helicopters. And that's where the music becomes essential. Without the soundtrack fully committing to this tone, the game could easily collapse under its own absurdity. Instead, the music grounds everything, making the chaos feel intentional. Like the world needs to be loud, aggressive, and overwhelming to make sense at all. The soundtrack for Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance was composed primarily by Jamie Christopherson, who took a bold and unconventional approach to scoring the game. Instead of leaning on orchestral music or subtle ambient tracks, Christopherson built the soundtrack around industrial metal, electronic rock, and heavily distorted vocals. This wasn't music designed to sit quietly behind the gameplay, it was designed to collide with it. One of the most distinctive aspects of the score is its dynamic structure. Many tracks evolve during combat, introducing vocals only when fights reach critical moments. The music doesn't just react to what's happening on screen, it escalates alongside it, making combat feel like a performance rather than a sequence of mechanics. Within the game itself, the music acts as an extension of the combat system. Fights often begin with instrumental tracks that build tension through heavy beats and electronic textures. As encounters escalate, especially during boss fights, the soundtrack explodes. Vocals crash into the mix, guitars intensify, and lyrics begin reinforcing the ideology of the character you're fighting. A perfect example of this is Rules of Nature, which plays during the opening Metal Gear Ray fight. The moment the vocals hit, the game makes a very clear statement. This is not a subtle experience, and it has no intention of becoming one. Boss themes are particularly effective because they aren't just hype tracks, they're narrative tools. Each major enemy's music reflects their worldview, turning combat into an ideological clash rather than just a physical one. The soundtrack doesn't tell you who's right or wrong, it forces you to engage with those ideas while trying to survive. Outside of the game itself, the soundtrack for Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance has taken on a life of its own. Tracks like It Has to Be This Way and Collective Consciousness have become internet staples, showing up in memes, edits, workout playlists, and dramatic moments where the situation absolutely did not require that level of intensity, but benefited from it anyway. The music has a way of instantly making you feel unstoppable. You throw one of these tracks and suddenly you're convinced you're Raiden, a cybernetic warrior with perfect reflexes, unwavering convictions, and a personal soundtrack that kicks in right when things get serious. But in reality, you're just some guy in your room wearing headphones, aggressively nodding along to industrial metal while pretending to slash a sword into your mortal enemy. And that's kind of the magic of it. The soundtrack is so confident and expressive that it transcends the game itself. Even people who haven't played Rising recognize the music because it communicates intensity instantly. You don't need context to feel the urgency, the aggression, or the larger than life energy. The music delivers all of that on its own. That culture reach is rare for a video game soundtrack, and it's why Rising's music continues to resurface years later. It doesn't rely on nostalgia or familiarity, it relies on raw energy. The kind that makes you feel powerful even if only it's for the length of the song. When you really sit down and listen to the music of Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, what becomes immediately clear is that the soundtrack wasn't made to be polite, subtle, or comforting. It exists to hit you, to push you, and to keep you on edge. Just like the game itself, there's no soft landing, no gentle reminders that it's just a game. The soundtrack is aggressive, relentless, and it understands exactly what kind of experience it's supporting. Unlike many action game soundtracks, which aims to amplify excitement or provide emotional cues, Rising's music does more than that. It establishes the tone, pace, and philosophy of the world itself. From the opening notes of Rules of Nature to the final crescendo of It Has to Be This Way, the soundtrack communicates urgency, tension, and ideological conflict, often simultaneously. One of the most remarkable things about the music is its dynamic structure. Tracks don't just loop endlessly in the background, they escalate as fights progress. They introduce layers of distortion, vocals, and guitar riffs precisely the moments when combat hits a turning point. In boss fights, this is particularly noticeable. The music evolves as the enemy moves through phases, intensifying the feeling that the conflict itself is alive and reacting to your actions. You're not just fighting an enemy, you're responding to a musical conversation that frames their ideology and your choices. And speaking of ideology, the soundtrack is one of the rare examples where lyrics actually matter. Characters sing their motivations, their beliefs, and their justifications for violence while simultaneously trying to kill you. Unlike a standard cutscene or dialogue box, the music makes this confrontation feel immediate, personal, and unavoidable. You're not just executing mechanics, you're engaging with ideas expressed through rhythm, distortion, and pure industrial energy. It's basically philosophy class, but with screaming guitars and lasers. The standout track that perfectly embodies this approach is The Only Thing I Know for Real. On first listen, it's a sonic assault. Distorted guitars, pounding drums, and electrifying vocals driving the pace forward like a speeding train. But beneath that aggression, there's a carefully layering of tension and melody. The rhythm mirrors the back and forth of combat. You strike, the music responds. They strike, the music responds. There's an almost physical energy to it, making you feel like you're moving with the soundtrack, not just hearing it. So give it a listen. While you're listening, I want you to try and listen for layering, the energy, and the way it feels like the fight is guiding the music as much as the music is guiding the fight. Another standout feature is the soundtrack emotional depth beneath the chaos. While it's overwhelmingly aggressive, there are layers of melancholy, tension, and moral reflection embedded in the composition. You can hear the strain in Raiden's journey, the doubt, the guilt, and the relentless pressure to act in a world that constantly demands violence. The soundtrack doesn't give you the resolution or closure, it keeps pushing forward, mirroring the game's themes, the consequences of conflicts, the cost of conviction, and the impossibility of perfect ideals in a flawed world. And finally, the soundtrack succeeds because it's confident. Rising doesn't shy away from the loud guitars, screaming vocals, or industrial chaos. It knows exactly what it is, a musical embodiment of Raiden's cybernetic identity, his battles, and the ideological conflicts that define the game. It commits fully to that identity, and doing so creates a listening experience that is unforgettable, exhilarating, and at times downright exhausting, in the best way possible. By the time you reach the final tracks, you realize the genius of it all. The music doesn't just support the game, it shapes it, defines it, and carries the emotion. Intensity and philosophy from start to finish. And even years later, it continues to feel alive, aggressive, and inspiring. Proof that a soundtrack that fully commits to its vision can be as impactful as the gameplay itself. When we talk about music analysis, what are we really doing is breaking a piece apart to understand how and why it works. Not just whether it sounds cool, and the soundtrack of Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is a perfect case study, because its music is deliberately constructed to serve gameplay, narrative, and emotion all at once. Let's start with the melody. Unlike traditional game soundtracks that rely on clear, memorable themes, Rising often keeps its melodies fragmented or buried beneath distortion. When a melody does appear, it's usually short, aggressive, and repetitive. This creates a sense of obsession and urgency rather than comfort. The melodies don't invite you to relax, they push forward relentlessly, mirroring the constant motion and violence of the game itself. Moving into harmony, the soundtrack avoids warm or resolved chord progression. Instead, it leans heavily on power chords and unstable harmonic movement. This lack of resolution keeps the player in a constant state of tension. You rarely feel musically at rest, which reinforces the idea that this world and Raiden himself never truly get peace. Rhythm is one of the most important elements in the score. The music relies on driving mechanical rhythms that often feel rigid and industrial. These rhythms are tightly locked to a combat pacing, making every slash, parry, and dodge feel synchronized with the soundtrack. Fast tempos increase adrenaline, while sudden rhythmic drops or pauses heighten anticipation before the next surge of action. In terms of form, many tracks are built in layers rather than traditional verse-chorus structures. A fight might begin with stripped-down instrumental version of a track, then gradually introduce guitars, vocals, and heavier percussion as the battle escalates. This evolving structure makes the music feel reactive, as if it's responding directly to how the fight is unfolding rather than looping passively in the background. This brings us to texture. Rising music is dense and aggressive, often stacking distorted guitars, electronic synths, industrial noise, and vocals all at once. But despite this density, each layer serves a purpose. The texture reflects chaos, conflict, and overload, the same sensation the player experiences during intense combat. Even when the music feels overwhelming, it's carefully balanced rather than random. Close related is timbre, or the quality of the sound. The soundtrack makes heavy use of distorted guitars, harsh electronic tones, and processed vocals. These timbres reinforce the game's theme of cybernetic enhancements and loss of humanity. The music doesn't sound clean because the world isn't clean. Everything is sharp, metallic, and strained. Dynamics play a crucial role in emotional impact. The soundtrack constantly shifts between restraint and explosion. Quiet moments create tension, while sudden dynamic surges release it. When the music swells at key moments, it amplifies the emotional weight of the action, making victories feel harder earned and conflicts feel more personal. A great example of these elements working together is Rules of Nature. This track starts with controlled energy, gradually layering rhythm, texture, and harmonic tension. When the vocals finally enter, it feels like a breaking point, not just musically, but emotionally. The form, dynamics, and timbre align perfectly with the gameplay, turning the fights into something cinematic and unforgettable. Finally, it's important to consider historical and cultural context. Metal Gear Rising pulls heavily from industrial metal and electronic rock, genres historically associated with rebellion and resistance. By blending these styles with video game scoring, the composer creates a soundtrack that feels both modern and ideologically charged. This wasn't accidental. It reflects a deliberate compositional choice to align the music with the game's theme of power, identity, and conflict in a technologically driven world. All of these elements, melody, harmony, rhythm, form, texture, timbre, dynamics, and context, come together to reveal why the soundtrack works so well. It isn't just exciting music layered over gameplay, it's a carefully designed system that communicates meaning, reinforces narrative, and shapes emotional response. The music doesn't just support the experience, it explains it, challenges it, and embeds itself into how the game is remembered. At its core, the music of Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance shows just how powerful a game's soundtrack can be when it fully commits to its identity. It doesn't just accompany the experience, it defines it. The music transforms combat into storytelling, spectacle into ideology, and action into expression. Long after the final fight ends, those distorted guitars and shouted lyrics linger, not as nostalgia, but as an instant remembered. And with that, if you have a favorite soundtrack from the game, drop it in the comments down below. If there's another game whose music deserves a deep dive like this, let me know in the comments down below. While you're down there, why don't you hit the like button and subscribe? I have a goal of reaching 1,000 subscribers this year. I think we can do it, so please hit the subscribe button. It'd mean a lot to me. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.